has so eloquently laid a foundation for us on the political systems, the policy cycle, and the power relationships within Aotearoa New Zealand's political system. My aim is to now build on that, exploring further the relationships of these systems and to introduce other players within social work practice, highlighting influences that exist to shape social policy. Kerry-Ann identified stage 1 of the process as agenda setting. This is one point in which social workers are able to influence the shaping of social policy. Aotearoa Association of Social Workers is a governing body to which social workers align themselves. They identify that social work promotes social change, empowerment, and they go on to say that a social worker acts to intervene where people interact with their environment. The role of advocacy is inherent in social work and embedded in the ANZ ASW practice standards, which states in section 9 that a social worker will have met the required standards for advocacy by contributing to social policy making, whether through personal agency and/or the ANZ ASW processes. An example of this was the contribution made through the ANZ ASW to the regarding the Vulnerable Children Act to the Select Committee of Social Services. The ANZ ASW declared in this that they were the voice of their members, who are of course social workers, and they went on to observe that the bill had a direct effect on the social work profession. So we see the relationship modelled there. This submission by the ANZ ASW will have been played out in stage 3, the Select Committee stage that Kerry-Ann talked about earlier. Legal Advisor for Open Home Foundation, or OHF, Mandy, says that in practice a representative from a credible agency has as much and arguably more opportunity to influence policy at that stage than they might have through formal submissions to Select Committee, because often agendas, Mandy says, are set well before this stage, which supports Kerry-Ann's notion earlier that the policy process is not necessarily linear. Kerry-Ann cites Shaw and Eichbaum as signalling that the formulating policy stage, this is where it's necessary for consultation to happen with individuals and groups such as OHF to allow those players, those frontline players, to determine whether or not the potential policy is in fact workable. An example of a time where OHF influenced policy and subsequently legislation is in the Income Tax Act. We see here that in the Income Tax Act of 2007, it states that payments for foster care under section 363 of the Oranga Tamariki Act are exempt from taxation because OHF argued it wasn't income. Oranga Tamariki in their Act of 1989 identified that a child and family support service is duty bound to ensure that a caregiver receives adequate financial support to meet the reasonable needs of a child in their care. So in this example we see that the tax exemption for foster care payments was argued to be necessary to uphold the rights of OHF's client, in this case the foster parents, to enable them to receive adequate distribution of resources. And this of course will influence better outcomes for the child in care. We also see the interaction of the various systems in play, so that in this one we see the economic system working with the social system. So we see social work influences the allocation of resources, it responds to the needs of the most vulnerable. We suggest, or Mendes suggests, that social workers can remain neutral or apolitical, but this encourages a sense of mediocrity and the status quo. Social workers have a responsibility, says Mendes, to represent their clients in the development of social policy. The 1840 signing of the treaty provides, according to Ruka, a tangible BC AD moment a demarcation line between who New Zealand was and what she has become. So Kerry Ann identified that the 1840 signing of the Treaty of Waitangi was intended to establish British sovereignty in exchange for a guarantee for Māori to enjoy undisturbed possession of their land and resources. Ruka invites the reader to consider that in fact there are two versions of this. One is the Treaty of Waitangi, the English version, the other is Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Māori translation. And a debate continues as to what was the intent of this agreement. Ruka goes on to point out that the treaty is not only embedded in our history as a nation, but it's embedded in the history of the church within our nation. And it's also therefore embedded in the history of our social policies and legislation. As an employee of OHF, I have signed an agreement to the statement that suggests that the treaty should be considered as a solemn agreement, a covenant signed before God between Māori and the Crown, and I love that description. We see in the book of Isaiah how God regards covenant. We see him stating that regardless of our troubles, his covenant of peace will never be removed from us. So we recognise that God is a covenant maker and he's a covenant keeper. Mulholland talks about the three articles of the treaty being interconnected. Article 1, power and authority, was intended to allow British sovereignty over British subjects. This was disregarded as the Crown assumed governance not only over British subjects but also over Māori. This article is the most strongly contested with regards to the various translations to the two translations. The 1863 New Zealand Settlement Act contributed to the confiscation of Māori land for the betterment of colonials. And in this, I suggest it does not signal the adherence to the intent of the covenant. Article 2 relates to power and the protection of resources and culture. And if implemented, Article 2 would have ensured Māori power, resources and tikanga were protected. Colonial practices of physical discipline influenced the Native Schools Act of 1867, which saw disciplinary practices introduced in Māori culture. Māori children forbidden to speak Te Reo Māori. In this, Māori tikanga or culture was in fact not protected. Article 3, which relates to equality, the lack of adherence to Articles 1 and 2 mean that the social equality which Māori believed was being offered to them through Article 3 was arguably not realised. Political ideology, Mulholland suggests, will shape the individual perspective as to whether or not Māori enjoy equality today. From a social policy perspective, Hua Te Atatu, or the Daybreak Report, was commissioned by the then Minister of Social Welfare in 1988 to establish how the Department of Social Welfare was responding with regards to a Māori perspective. The committee found that social welfare institutions, and indeed the courts, have a clientele which is predominantly Māori. So in this, according to Graham Cameron, we see that indication that 30 years on from that report, the recommendations made within it have not been fulfilled. An example of where social work interacts with Te Ao Māori is the practice of whāngai. So whāngai, Keane explains, is the custom of a child being raised by someone other than their birth parents. Whāngai differs from the European ideas of adoption or foster care, which is steeped in privacy. The decision to whāngai a child is a community decision, with the child having full knowledge of their birth parents. And it's also said to be practiced for a number of reasons, some of which include the enhancement of whanaungatanga, which is whānau connectedness, but also to address the idea or the notion of land inheritance or succession. Generally, King suggests whāngai has received little recognition within the law. So legislation which has and continues to influence whāngai include 1881, the Adoption Act, which did not impact the status of whāngai. So in this, whāngai remained acknowledged within the law. 1901, the Native Land Claims and Adjustment Act allowed whāngai children to have a way in which to succeed with land. 1955, significant moment, the Adoption Act implemented closed adoption. This meant that whāngai was no longer recognised within the law, and the recommendation or the requirement was that all connections to biological whānau were severed, regardless of the child's culture. And I suggest that in this, the Act was discriminatory and did not reflect the principles of te tiriti. In 1993, Te Ture Whenua Māori Act provides for whāngai children to succeed in land, bringing some legal recognition. ANZ-ASW has a response, or recognises a responsibility to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and outlines in Section 1 some principles including that Te Tiriti o Waitangi is a required subject for social work education, that members are required to understand tangata whenua perspectives and avoid imposing monocultural values on tangata whenua, and that monocultural control over power and resources should cease, allowing tēnā tiratanga or self-determination, which speaks to Article 2 of the treaty. So what are the implications of all of the above on social work practice? So implementation, which Kerry Ann identifies as stage 4 of the policy process, is another point in which the relationship between social policy, legislation and social work comes alive. Actors within the implementation stage include government departments, so that is the Justice Department, the Ministry of Education, Oranga Tamariki. Some examples of the next group would be the non-state providers or the NGOs, non-government organisations, include the likes of iwi organisations, Ngāpuhi Iwi Social Services and OHF. Social workers at the front line are not only influential in policy formulation, but also in implementation and critical evaluation of the success or otherwise of policies implemented. It's here that we see the integration of faith-based services such as the Salvation Army in their State of Nation report. So this is used as a barometer to measure the outcomes of various policies, providing critical evaluation. Social workers are not only obliged to uphold the law, they're also bound to various codes within governing bodies, both domestic and international. And some examples are the United Nations, who in 1948 produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. New Zealand, as a signatory to this declaration, now require that social workers uphold the rights outlined in this document. Marshall explains that while the UDHR, the Human Rights Declaration, is not legally binding, it is used as a point of reference as to whether or not there has been a breach of human rights. Social worker practicing within the justice system will need to know that Article 3 of the UDHR defends the right of each person to have security of person. They also need to know that Section 59 of the Corrections Act allows a prison manager to relocate a prisoner who feels that their safety is threatened. Knowing that information will help the social worker better advocate on behalf of the client. Using a strength-based theory of practice, a social worker will engage with a client in a power with rather than a power over way, which will ultimately empower the individual and families they're working with. So what this does is upholds the standards set by the International Federation of Social Workers, which defines social work and includes an obligation to promote empowerment and Indigenous knowledges. Speaking, of course, to the self-determination offered to tangata whenua in the treaty. So while there's no legal obligation to uphold this mandate, it does speak to a commitment to professionalism and ethical practice. The Social Workers Registration Bill currently before the government is sitting in its second reading stage and will bring mandatory regulation to social workers. This will bring a greater accountability before the law, according to ANZASW. Sherwood tells us that we need to respect other worldviews and faith perspectives, and he suggests that it is always okay to demonstrate the gospel when it's not appropriate for a social worker to declare it. ANZASW Code of Ethics warns against allowing our own religious convictions to override a person's right to independence. Social workers are bound to uphold the law, influencing policy when laws are oppressive or unjust. This seeks to outwork the biblical mandate to act justly, to love mercy and walk humbly. Kerry Ann and I contend that this is, or at least should be, true of all social workers, but how much more so when what we're doing is an offering to God.